Welcome to Podcast Done For You, the show where we make it as easy as possible for you to make the right choices to advance your podcasting career. So let's get started on the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Podcast Done For You. And we're going to talk about the thing that most people stuff up the most when it comes to their podcast and how to ensure you get it right. Well, what is that thing? Well, I'll tell you what it's not. Because I know that a lot of you are thinking, okay, it has to be something around the production. Maybe it's the video, maybe it's the editing, maybe it's the graphics, maybe it's the way you transition from one thing to another. Maybe it's that you don't ask often enough for people to subscribe, or you don't have a lead magnet for things to go to. All those things are great. They're really important, but it is not the thing that most people stuff up completely when it comes to their podcast. And I'll give you one other tip. It's not the audio. Even though the audio is absolutely the most critical thing to get right, it's the easiest thing to, quite frankly, get right. And we've done an episode previously about choosing the right microphone. Check it out if you haven't done so already. That is not a difficult thing to overcome. The biggest challenge that most people have comes around when they decide to have a guest on their podcast. Why? Why do they have this problem? What is the problem? Well, it's as simple as this. If you have someone as a guest on your program, decide for me, are you the interviewer? Are you the supporter? Are you the fan? Or are you the person that needs to build your credibility? Is that the reason that you have the podcast in the first place? The answer is more than likely yes. You've got the podcast to benefit you. You didn't build the podcast to benefit your guests, not unless you're incredibly generous or you're someone who is being paid copious amounts to interview celebrities, for example. That's a whole different story. But if you're doing a business podcast, and I'm talking to particularly people in that professional services type space, where you've got people that you perhaps want to bring in, whether they be clients that you're wanting to showcase their stories, whether they're peers or whether there's someone else that you want to bring into the conversation, the important part amongst all of that is that you are the most credible person in the podcast. So how do you make that happen if you're interviewing someone? Well, it is one of the most underestimated things about podcasting is the ability to conduct the interview and remain an expert. It really fascinates me when I look around at all of the opportunities you have to get assistance with podcasting is none of them will sit down and really do the interview for you. And it's really something that you need to think carefully about because the fact of the matter is that doing the interview is a skill, as we said, on their own to be able to do. And you take a look around, watch TV or listen to the radio. There are people that are professionally trained to conduct interviews, to hold conversations. And I will make that point as well. Most podcasts make the mistake of conducting it as an interview. Now, it's not an interview. It shouldn't be an interview. It should be a conversation. And that conversation is important because then your credibility rises because you're involved in that conversation. A conversation by nature is involving at least two people, right? Whereas if you're doing an interview, it's really about asking them questions all the time. Now, the problem with either way of looking at it is that if you are constantly thinking about what's the next part of the conversation, where is this going to go? What do I need to ask them? How do I need to engage with them next? One of two things happens. You either take your eye off the ball of what you're doing, or you've got such a predetermined script that you're not getting the most out of your guest or you for that matter. So you're not really listening to them. And then the other thing that happens, by the way, the third thing that can happen is that you end up talking so much that you forget about your guests and then you make them feel uncomfortable and you've done nothing to benefit that relationship. Now you laugh at me, perhaps sitting there, But I know I've had this conversation with someone just recently where they were appalled by the fact that they'd been a guest on a program and they estimated that 90% of the time the podcaster was speaking. They got 10% of the airtime. Now, that's not really great for your guest, and that's taking it to the other extreme. And that again happens because you might be so focused on building your own credibility that you forget about the guest and you want to constantly have your say and put it over the top. That doesn't work either. So it is a really important factor to consider. Now, there are lots of ways that you can do this, but I need you to understand the problem fully. So when you are doing an interview with a guest, right, and I'm talking about an interview for a moment, what tends to happen is you have a list of questions. And if those questions don't lead you to the next, the answers don't lead you to the next question, then you're in trouble, aren't you? What happens when they answer multiple things in answering one question, but they've actually answered several other questions along the way? Suddenly your pre-prepared notes can be thrown out the window. You have to really listen to it. Now, again, I would say to you, if you're conducting it like an interview, and I've heard some, quite frankly, horrific podcasts out there, and I'm sure you've heard them as well. The most extreme I heard was where clearly what has happened is in advance, people have been sent the questions, and I'll come back to that point in a minute, and they've been sent it. They record themselves as a guest answering those questions, and then the questions are dropped in later and combined in editing for the two, and you have a podcast. It sounded horrible, really horrible. If I hope you don't engage with those kind of podcasts or intend to do something like that. But it is really important to understand that when you're doing it as an interview, right, the opportunity for you to stand out is minimized. And if you're doing an interview and you're not listening, then you've even got less opportunity to get ahead in what you're doing and achieve more listeners, because people will be listening to your podcast. And whilst you might not be listening because you're so busy looking at the next question and hoping that you can get to that one and watching the clock and all of those other things, your listeners are listening and they can tell when that is the case. You can tell. I mean, you've listened to podcasts, right? And you've heard that. You've heard that, well, hang on, they said something really interesting there, and clearly they've just decided, the podcaster has just decided to move to the next question because they've not been paying close enough attention to something that has been said previously. And that can lead you down a whole different way. And that's what the difference is between an interview and a conversation as well, by the way. When you're having a conversation, someone will say something, and even though you'd intended it to go this way, it can go that way. And why? Because it's interesting. Because someone raises a story and you bounce off that story and you go down a different path, for example. Or they mention something where you think, well, that was a little detail, but I actually want to go back and focus on that detail. So it's really important to not go in with such a preconceived idea of doing that. Now, again, that's the difference between a conversation and an interview. When you're doing an interview, as journalists do, and I've been a journalist, and you're trying to get something out of someone, right? You're going to ask a series of questions, and you might keep asking those questions in different ways until you get what you want, depending on the person that you're interviewing. I mean, look at any sports game, for example. There is an interview that is conducted after the game, right? And they interview the people who have been competing. Usually it's pretty similar questions most of the time, but they have a specific purpose in mind. It's not a conversation that they're trying to have. They are trying to say, how did you feel when you did such and such? What's happening next week? How is your injury? That's the kind of thing that people are going to ask in an interview. But again, you're not doing that. You should be having a conversation. Now, again, whether you are trying to have a conversation or you have fallen into the idea of, because it suits your market, to do an interview, the important part is you being the credible person. Now, if you think about it, when you catch up with someone and you have a conversation with them, you're not focused on you being the expert. You're focused on wherever the stories take you, and that's fine. So that's why you often need a third party to come back and say to you, hey, what about your thoughts? We've just heard from the guest. What about your thoughts? And it takes a third party to be able to understand and maneuver that conversation. It's a bit like, for example, when you go to a conference, right? We've all been to conferences, haven't we? And they have a bunch of speakers. At the end of the conference, there is often some kind of panel discussion, and there is someone that will MC that panel discussion to make sure all of the experts get a fairly even say in answering whatever questions are being raised. So that is a sort of more of can be a balance between an interview and a conversation, depending on the nature of that panel. But when you're, for example, just privately having a conversation with one another, you're not necessarily focused on you being the expert, because that's different. That's a closed conversation. But you have to remember that you're doing your podcast for you, not for the guest. And as I said at the beginning, one of the problems that happens when people conduct these kinds of conversations or interviews is that they become the fan or the supporter. Either way is not a good outcome for you as the person wanting to build your credibility. It's all very well to be a supporter or a fan of the person that you have on the show, but it shouldn't be at the expense of you. And that means that you need to be interjecting with your expertise. Now, it's hard to do that, to have a conversation where you're interjecting as an expert and making sure that things are being steered along and where they're going next. Again, that's the reason why you have a third party in there. Now, if you think that it's something that you can just magically do, well, I say to you this: when you watch when you watch television with some kind of talking on it, whether it's a current affairs type program or even entertainment type programs, the people that are running those are not the experts. They're there either to provide some entertainment or to steer the conversation in a particular direction to get something out of their guests. Again, sometimes they're conversations, sometimes they're interviews. But when you're doing your own podcast, what is the value to your listeners? The value is that they want to feel like they're part of a conversation they couldn't otherwise be privy to. They want to hear from the experts. You want them to think of you as the expert as much as your guest. So, to wrap things up, one of the biggest faux pas that people make with a podcast and planning it is they go in thinking they can just do it themselves and they can conduct the interview and they can get away with it. Well, I would say to you this: the best people on television and radio have trained for many, many years to be able to deliver in a really great and entertaining way. Why do you think that you, as an expert in whatever area you're in, that you can just march in there and conduct an interview and still come off as the credible person, when even the professionals that do it on television don't try and be seen as the expert? They're just trying to be seen as steering a conversation. So why do you think magically that you can do that? It is a very, very difficult thing to pull off. And it's something that you need to think seriously about in planning your podcast. Do you really want to do it on your own? And do you want to have guests? Well, what I can tell you is that there are ways and means around that. And we offer one of those solutions at Podcast Done For You. And you can check the link out in the show notes. But basically, I offer a service where I'm the anchor of the program, where I am the co-host, anchor, whatever you want to call it, where I am making sure I'm steering the conversation, and I'm making sure that even though the guests are there, that you are still coming back to you and saying, hey, you are the expert in this area as well. What's your thoughts? It's important to be able to do that. It doesn't stop you from asking questions of your guests, but it does mean that someone is there and making sure that you are being seen at the same level that you deserve to be, because after all, that is why you are on this podcast journey. So I hope that's given you something to think about. If you want to have a chat about it, just for free, just to have a conversation, a real conversation offline to see whether this is something that you need to explore and consider. More than happy to do so. All the details are in the show notes as always. Thank you for paying attention to this. I hope that it's been of some value to you in your thinking process about getting your podcast up and running. I'm keen for you to get your podcast up and running. As I said, Podcast Done For You, which is responsible for this program, can do all of that for you. So all you have to do is worry about showing up as the expert. Until next time, and please, if you've got anything you want us to cover in future episodes, do so in the comments or get through to me directly on LinkedIn is probably the best way to do that. We look forward to your company next time on the Podcast Done For You show.